In the last section, we asked whether there could be a hierarchy of description for the brain, which would enable us to understand in an intuitively satisfying way. Why should brains have hierarchies of description usable by humans? Well, to progress a bit, let's ask, why do computer systems need to be understandable anyway? And here are 4 major reasons. If we didn't understand a computer system, it would be very difficult to add or modify its features. It would be very hard to diagnose and repair component failures. To see what I'm getting at, suppose that rather than designing a system, we got together lots and lots of technicians, gave them piles of transistors, and they connected transistors together at random to produce a system. Think of it as a caricature of the process of evolution. Every now and then, we test the result to see if it performs all the desired features. Now, it could be that after a very, very long time, we got a system that met all the specifications, but we've got a few problems with this working system. Suppose you wanted to add or modify a feature. How could you identify the specific component level changes needed, other than starting the whole random process again from zero? If the system failed, the only way to identify the failed component would be to try replacing components one by one until the system worked again. To build another copy of the system, you could duplicate it component by component, connection by connection. But if you made a mistake, how could you identify which component was misplaced? And the physical resources used by the system will be huge, because the random process will tend to result in lots of resources that have no functional role. Now, as we'll get to a little later, this caricature example also suggests some implications for brains. Let me go on to a couple more points. There's minimal direct resemblance between a brain and a computer. However, there are what I'll call meta-similarities. Different computer systems perform very different functions. There are, of course, personal computers. There's also computer systems that are specialized in game playing. Other computer systems are optimized for controlling the flight simulators used for training pilots. Yet other systems control manufacturing lines with very little human intervention. But all these different computer systems share the same high-level architecture, with the separation between memory and processing that I mentioned earlier. And another characteristic attribute of this architecture is an inherent tendency towards sequential processing, for reasons we'll return to later. But when you compare the brains of different mammal species, there are some striking high-level anatomical similarities. In other words, you can see the same major anatomical structures in brains as widely different as humans, rats, dolphins, analogous with what we are calling separations in the case of the computers, despite the very different behaviors that these different species need to learn. And, as with computers, these different anatomical structures don't seem to perform different types of cognitive processes. Rather, they all seem to contribute to all types of cognitive processes, each in a different way. When you take a vertical slice of a brain going from left to right, you get what's called a coronal section. And these are comparable coronal sections for a human and for a macaque-monkey brain. They look quite similar. At a more detailed level, the similar structures on the bottom right, in both cases, are called the hippocampus. And if we look more closely at this hippocampus, we can see that in both cases, the cortex thins down and curls around to end inside the V-shaped structure that's actually called the dentate gyrus. And the substructures of the hippocampus are similar in both human and monkey. And the neurons in one substructure of the human hippocampus are similar to the neurons in the corresponding macaque substructure and are connected together in very similar ways. And in case you think that humans are anyway fairly closely related to monkeys, you can see the same hippocampus, the same substructures, the same neuron types, even in marsupial mammals like the kangaroo, and in the even more distantly related monotreme mammals like the platypus. And it's not just the cortex and the hippocampus. You can see a cerebellum, a thalamus, and a hypothalamus, and other corresponding structures, again with similar neurons across the complete spectrum of mammals, from human to echidna, from monkey to dolphin. And not only mammals. In birds, the superficial physical resemblances are a little less, but there still appear to be structures corresponding with the hippocampus, thalamus, basal ganglia, cerebellum, and so on in both brains, with similar neuron types and similar connectivity. And the last common ancestor of songbird and human lived about 300 million years ago. In fact, the similarity between brains reaches even further back in evolutionary terms. A common physical brain architecture appears to be present across all vertebrates, from fish to human, with pallium, subpallium, and cerebellum. Projection neurons in the pallium, the cortex in the mammal brain, tend to be excitatory, while in the subpallium, the basal ganglia and so on in the mammals, projection neurons tend to be inhibitory. A structure corresponding with the hippocampus can be found in the most primitive brains, and the structure seems to support spatial and temporal memory across all the species. A structure corresponding with the amygdala, containing components derived from both the pallium and the subpallium, is universally present and associated with fear learning. A structure corresponding with the cerebellum is associated with timing of behaviors. In other words, it looks as if the same major anatomical structures, each performing different types of information processes that are shared by different types of cognitive processes, are common across all brains. So roughly speaking, just as all computers have the same high-level architecture, so all brains seem to have the same high-level architecture, although completely different from the computer architecture. And there's another meta-similarity between computers and brains. In computer systems, physical resources are organized into a modular hierarchy, with groups of transistors making up standard cells, groups of standard cells making up integrated circuits, groups of integrated circuits making up printed circuit assemblies, groups of printed circuit assemblies making up frames, and groups of frames making up the system. And at each level, there's much more information communication within a module than between a module and its peer modules. For example, there's much more information communication within an integrated circuit than between two integrated circuits, even if they're on the same printed circuit assembly. And in brains, something analogous exists in, for example, the cortex. The cortex as a whole has different areas. Each area has a number of columns, each column has a number of neurons, each neuron has a number of dendritic branches, each branch has a number of synapses. The key meta-similarity is that there's much more communication within a module on one level than between different peer modules. There's much more connectivity within a cortical column than between different columns. There's much more interaction within a neuron than between two neurons, and so on. And another meta-similarity is that in both cases there seems to be very little correspondence between physical modules and the sort of features that can be easily labeled by an observer or user of the system. So the key questions are, why do these meta-similarities exist? And what are the implications of these meta-similarities for understanding the brain?